Good afternoon. My name is Clinton Reiswig, and I'm a student I'm a student of the new PhD program, Innovation in Global Development, which is housed at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. I wanted to welcome all of you to this talk series that we are calling, this new talk series we're calling Development Reimagined. This is going to be one of the flagship series showcasing for the IGD's intellectual position. This semester, the theme of the series is Innovative Views on Decolonizing Development, and it was created as a way to imagine future strategies for the 21st century global development. As you can see, we have quite a few. We have a couple talks right here. Development is measured largely through economic growth, and how we approach solutions to development, to developmental challenges, depends upon how we view development itself. And progress, for better or worse, is often viewed through a Western lens. And the GDP is one of those lenses. So the informal sector is not included in the GDP, or is not included in the GDP lens, which restricts the understanding of development in many non-Western countries. More than 60% of the world's employed population are in the informal sector, and in Africa, it's 85% of the individuals who are employed are employed through an informal position. So today's talk is actually focused on decolonizing economic theory, reflections from the informal sector in Diani, Kenya. Diani, excuse me. And it proposes a different way of knowing and challenges us to think differently about economic theory. Innovation is not just about technological invention and application, but it is also social and institutional. Our speaker joined ASU in 2016 as a social innovator. She is director of and professor in the School of International Letters and Culture, and has written 4 books, one of the most recent books being Germans in the Kenyan Coast, Land, Charity, and Romance. She has done extensive work in Africa towards understanding Western influence on the continent. So if you please join me in welcoming Dr. Nina Berman.
Thank you for this kind introduction, Clint, and thank you for inviting me. I'm very honored to be the first speaker in this series that is clearly focused on very essential topics here in terms of thinking about development and the idea of, and the term decolonizing is of course the gesture to the longer history of relations between global north and global south, and how maybe our contemporary paradigms, even though we think we are so different in how we approach things in terms of development, may be actually rooted very deeply in long-term patterns of the relations between the global north and the global south. My talk is really work in progress in some ways. It's building on, what I will say today is building on research that I've done in Kenya mostly since 2009. I've been traveling to Kenya since 1980, but doing research in Kenya since 98, but for this particular project since 2009. But some of these thoughts about the economy are really more recent in terms of how I approach it, and I've been benefiting very much from having conversations with colleagues, some at ASU, some of whom are in the room here from the School for the Future of Innovation Society. We have a working group on thinking about and I put it now in quotation marks, the informal sector. So it's work in progress, and it's an ongoing conversation. And I really look forward to the opportunity to share my work here and to hearing some of your thoughts. So I will be mainly talking about 2 main issues. And one that is how my case study on Kenya sheds light on development cultures. And the idea here is that development culture more broadly is very much still rooted in colonial history and the civilizing mission in modernization discourse, and as such is on this continuum. And my case study about this area in Kenya will shed light on that. And out of that comes my more recent interest in theorizing labor and the interest in understanding the impact of what I've been observing in terms of how we understand the economy. So I have a manuscript that is really not syncing up with the slides anymore. So we'll see how I will be using it. But generally, I think a lot of us here in the room will agree that much state and industry-based development, discourse, and policy is rooted in an inadequate understanding of economic activity. And I think what I'm observing here is that even though since the 1970s, especially anthropologists and cultural geographers have weighed in on this discussion in very substantial ways, economic theory, as it comes out of economics departments, is not very much affected by it. Right? So the way economics is taught at this university and other universities, whether it's in our economics department or in the business school, is not affected enough by the insights that especially anthropologists and cultural geographers have brought to the table in terms of looking at economic activities in a much broader sense. Right? So the dual factor, well, I think I'm jumping ahead here. So I think this is one of the key thoughts that I hope we can discuss and also really pick up at ASU more broadly. So there are scholars, so we have this dual sector theory since the early 1970s, 1971 to be exact, that there's a formal sector and an informal sector. And a lot of people have acknowledged that there is a flow between these two sectors, and the sort of activities that are in the informal sector are gaining more and more attention, also in terms of policymakers and global policymakers and so forth. But it still hasn't affected a lot of how economics is taught and understood and discussed. So what I've observed in Diani, and I will get into that in a second, is actually something that's even outside of what is commonly accepted to be part of informal sector forms of labor. Right? So what I'm presenting today is also not included in what conventionally is understood as economic activity that occurs in the informal sector. And so we have to ask some questions about why that is the case, and maybe that is something we can discuss later in the economy. And some of what I'm saying here is also relevant to looking at how economies are changing in the global north, the gig economies, internships that are unpaid, general precarization of labor. So we have more and more areas in the global north also that see economic activity and labor outside of the formal sector. So let's zoom in a little bit on Kenya. So this is a map of Kenya. And my work, it was done mostly south of Mombasa. Mombasa is this largest port city in East Africa. The capital of Nairobi is here. And the Kenyan coast has been a part of the Indian Ocean economy for a very long time. Right? So it's has established communities for over 1,000 years, Mombasa as a city, but also on the various islands. And it's really a sort of, I call it the multiculturalism of the old world, right? Because you have communities of Indians and Arabs and Africans and Europeans, Muslims, Hindu, Christians living together, interacting for a very long time already. This is the particular area that I've been looking at. It's basically an area of 10 by 2 miles. I'm sorry, I'm switching back and forth between kilometers and miles, but basically 10 kilometers and 3 kilometers inland. And the area developed as a tourism destination in the 1960s, 1970s. So hotels came up along the beach, and then gradually, over time, in the 1980s, but then especially 1990s, we see also a lot of development, a lot of real estate developments. So a lot of especially Europeans who bought second homes. We also have some retirement migration here. Then gradually we also get the elite from Nairobi and upcountry buying up land and so forth. So you see an area here close to the beach that is populated mostly by Europeans or wealthy African Kenyans or Indian Kenyans. So as you're moving inland, it moves from white and Indian and rich African Kenyan to pretty much 100% black Kenyans living here. Right? So it's a microcosm of all kinds of things that are going on here. And down here you have, in this area, for example, there's a cluster of Germans living, while up here there's a cluster of Italians. So we have an Italian ghetto and a German ghetto here, and they refer to it like that. And overall, there are several thousand Europeans who have property here, and they're moving in and out of the space in the course of the year. So, I mean, just to give you a little bit of sense why this became such a tourist destination, beautiful beaches, and the hotels were never sort of bought directly on the beach, so it preserves a lot of the original habitat. And you see in this area now, as a result of all this development, you have that occurred over such a short period of time. You see still the traditional clay huts here. And you see, I mean, this is the cocos palm leaf roof, and then this is a clay structure. And these are often right next to villas that have big security fences with electricity on top and glass and so forth. This is an especially vicious one. And this is a picture I took when I was in a small airplane. You see, this is the kind of new development that's popping up, and that's where most of the Europeans or wealthy Kenyans live. Right? So these areas are very in close proximity to these kind of structures. So basically, what we've seen in this area is, as a result of tourism development, a process of gentrification. Right? I've been using this term that is often used mostly for urban settings, but I think that there are some arguments to use it also for other areas, and it really makes sense here, because you have basically other ethnic and social groups pushing out one or several social ethnic groups pushing out other socially and ethnic or religiously distinct groups out of a certain space, right? So if we go back to the map, actually, the original villages are now sort of squeezed in the middle, right? So you have development coming from both sides. The original villagers live here and here, while the sort of upscale development comes, encroaches from one side, and the development from the poorer area of the emerging city of Ukunda from the other side. Right? So right now there are about 75,000 people living in this area. In the 50s and 60s there were maybe 5,000 villagers living there. Right? So it's changed dramatically within a very short period of time. And even though there were more coherent plans for development, at some point it's largely unregulated development. So as a result of this gentrification, you have a lot of the local population that experiences more economic pressure than before. Right? So for example, people who owned land sold their land, but then they didn't have any, either they lost even the land on which they lived, or they lost the land on which they farmed. Right? So while they got at some point a significant amount of money, for them significant, usually completely under market, they did not know exactly what to do with that, how to invest this in a way that they could also benefit from it down the road. right? So a lot of people who sold land, used it up, used that money, the proceeds from the sale, used it up within a short period of time. And then they became sort of squatters on their own land. And that's one way to look at it. And also we have an influx of immigrants from other parts of Kenya who came to the area fighting over the same jobs. And so they are also often poor and don't have jobs. And so there is a lot of economic pressure in the area. And what I studied more or less, I wrote up that history, but then I also wanted to describe in more detail how local people then try to survive. What are the strategies that they can come up with that enables them to benefit economically also from the tourism industry, even if they didn't have jobs in the hotels, right? And so I've observed these two main forms of interacting, and both, though, have elements that resonate with development discourse. And that's because of the personal relationships that people have established with these mostly Europeans. So one is known locally as charity. And it involves, well, we'll go through the actors in a moment, but it basically is a way where local people mobilize humanitarian energies that somehow are already as a disposition in a lot of the tourists who come to the area, or the settlers. A lot of people are also settling there. And the other one is through romantic relationships. And I really mean romantic relationships here, not short-term prostitution, but relationships that last several years. And I started tracking a number of these relationships, and pretty much everybody I engage with starting in 2009, they're still together. So this is really, there are often very stable relationships that happen over a long period of time. I went through 20 years of marriage licenses at the Registrar of Mombasa to get a sense of how many, because I was looking particularly at Germans, I wanted to understand how many of the Europeans or foreigners who marry Kenyans were Germans, and that's a very large percentage. It ranged from 70% in the 80s and 90s to today it's about 40%. So other groups have moved in there too. But marriage is only about 10% of the interaction that goes on. And also in these romantic relationships, you see there is a resonance with this global discourse of development, right? Just to give you an example, I once wanted to buy a banana from somebody, and the person says, "Can you please sponsor me by buying this banana?" Right? It wasn't about me buying his fruit, but it was like he thought the transaction was one of sponsoring him, right? Just like people always look for sponsors for their various projects. So that's there in the vocabulary, and it really permeates all types of personal relationships. So who are the main actors? So in terms of the changes with regard to land ownership and also the businesses that were created, there are a significant number of successful Germans. I mean, people move in and out, but these two are two of the most successful ones. Both of them have substantial, acres of land, but also created businesses. Like he owns pretty much a shopping mall and the most successful safari business, and a number of other things. So in addition to Germans, you also see some British characters, and Italians are mostly on the north coast. So the south coast is sort of dominated by Germans and British. And then we have in the area of charity what I call contraband humanitarians. I call it contraband humanitarians because none of what they do in terms of economic activity is registered anywhere. So they usually have fundraising networks in Germany, or Switzerland, or Austria, or Britain as well, but I focus on the Germans. And then they take that money, and they have usually some local contacts, and then they start their own sort of development mission. And I spent one day with this gentleman here, who was driving around in a big SUV, almost like the district commissioner. And we went from school to school and from well to well, and we were looking at all his different projects. And there were people standing at the side of the road, handing him sort of proposals for sponsorship and estimates for what something would cost. You know, so as we were driving along, there were people in various locations who just waited for him, who comes to the country about 3 to 4 times. And then, you know, he picks up the proposal, considers it, and then it gets sponsored or not. And this was a stop at a well that he sponsored, so he bought a pump and also had it installed, and there were about 4 or 5 of those pumps. And for these villagers, it was really essential because their old pump was defunct, the government was not replacing it, so they were actually walking 4 hours to the next water source. And so Mr. X, you know, established this well directly in their village and really had a substantial impact, right? This is a woman who, she's not a contraband humanitarian because she does things sort of by the books and is within the Kenyan system, is integrated into the Kenyan system through a private secondary school for girls that she built. But she also has a funding network in Germany, and pretty much those sponsors pay for all of the cost of the boarding school. So this is actually the construction site for the boarding school, and the school has about 120, 130 girls, and most of them now have sponsors. And the quarter or third that doesn't have sponsors, that they are funded locally, and but overall it's a pretty successful project too. Okay, and it had a large compound, so she bought all the land, so she has a company, and where she's the owner of some of these things and the director of other things, but it's a pretty substantial compound with, you know, several classrooms and the boarding school and the kitchen, and then she started experimenting with various sustainability initiatives. For example, she started growing fish at some point, farming fish, right? Tilapia, but that was a little bit difficult. But so she tries to come up with various sort of sustainable measures to be more independent, but right now the whole thing is completely and entirely dependent on the money that comes from Germany. This is a big water tank. It's the second Dorfbrunnen. So mind you, we are in Kenya here. This is a German word that means village water tank. And it was one of 3 that were built by this woman. So she actually has also an interesting record of, in the area, building various water tanks and then and also supporting schools. So she managed also through fundraising networks. This time this is Switzerland, but these are all fundraising networks that then support local children who go to a private school that she has co-founded. So I mean, in this area, you know, all of these cases, it's obvious, right, how the development discourse that is present in society on some level has reached ordinary citizen. I mean, she was a salesperson in a grocery store a department store before she came to Kenya. These are all completely people, often with no college education. I think the gentleman that I call the contraband humanitarian, I'm not sure that he has college education, but he had sort of a managerial position in the company. But yeah, it's kind of really interesting how this overall development discourse has reached so many people. So this is one of my favorite pictures, just because, you know, I always would like to know what the conversation was. And I have a number of these paparazzi pictures here where, well, this is not paparazzi. So this, for example, is a couple who I met in 2009. Longer, interesting story. They are, at this point, living in Switzerland. She managed, even though they were not married, she managed to get this person a residency permit and a work permit. Quite an accomplishment in Switzerland.
Yep.
And they're still together. I'm still in touch with them, and I was at their Christmas holiday in 2009. So this is actually her ex-husband, and they're, so yeah. The longer story is really interesting. And this is the former housekeeper who then became the girlfriend after. And then these two. And they're all still together. And there are various children connected to this, all of whom had school fees to pay and so forth. So this is not unusual. So you have these mixed couples who, whose relationship then affects a larger group of people. Right? So there's an estimate in Kenya that one salaried person supports 10 to 20 people in one way or another. And that's the figure that I'm using to estimate the economic impact of these relationships with Europeans. This is Papa Rudi, who is in a relationship with her, also still together. It's also interesting, he is a roofer and plumber, and he has a house in Turkey, and a house in Kenya, and a house in Berlin. And moves in and out of all these spaces. And this is another paparazzi picture, if you wish. Another one here. All right, so what about the quantitative side of this, right? That's what got me interested at some point. So how can I scale this? Are these just anecdotes? Is this just something that I observe here on a personal level? I've interviewed 60 people in romantic relationships. I interviewed another 50 maybe that were affected by humanitarian action. But how do I scale this? So one was through looking at the marriage licenses. And then, but I mean the general question, so the money that comes to Kenya, what is that really in terms of economic terms, right? Because these are not remittances. Remittances are sent by a foreign worker back home to his family. So these transfers that come through Western Union or MoneyGram or what have you, or the goods that people bring to the country, the cash that people bring to the country, it doesn't show up anywhere. It's not included in GDP or GNP. But in my estimates, just for this particular case that I'm looking up, I estimate that there are 1 to 2 million people on the Kenyan coast who have been affected financially or benefited financially from these two type of relationships, right? Either humanitarian or these very personal relationships that also have a sort of development perspective, a dimension there, right? And this is, if I'm using the 10 to 20 people are benefiting, then that's where I get up with this 1 to 2 million persons. It's not just on the coast. A lot of the people who interact with tourists and settlers on the coast also come from upcountry. But then there are also additional numbers of workers that I don't really, I didn't study. So we have all kinds of official aid workers, of course, permanent residents and humanitarians living in all parts of Kenya who also interact with Kenyans and also support people, pay school fees or do all kinds of stuff, right? So the overall monetary volume, I would argue, is significant. On the qualitative side, in terms of looking at what forms of labor are also rendered in exchange for the financial support, there's also an emotional dimension that goes, for both sides, obviously. But if you think about the labor that is done by the Kenyan partners, this nursing care, especially of the older, you remember the picture of the holiday, the party, right? The group of 6. 2 of them are definitely senior citizens who are basically taken care of by their younger girlfriends who are becoming nurses eventually over time. Right? And there are a number of these relationships and a number of interesting stories related to that. Then there's maintenance, cooking, cleaning, shopping. This is like domestic labor, but also some some gardening or agriculture, childcare, care of disabled children. There are several cases of that too. And so, you know, all of it creates a certain economic stability on the ground in the area that I studied, right? And for example, there is, and now I have a few examples here in terms of the housing situation. So local people have lost a lot of land, but it sort of comes back partially through these relationships. So through the relationships, a lot of people are acquiring property that is then either jointly owned, or often the title deed is in the name of the Kenyan partner, or the Kenyan partner had land and then the European partner builds a house on it. Right? So I walked with my research assistants up and down Diani, and they had all these stories, right, of this house is owned by a Digo man who owns 3 houses. He's in a relationship with a very old woman. She lives in Germany. He hangs out on the beach. I mean, I'm just quoting. A large house of a Swiss woman and her Kisi lover. Large house of a Digo man who lives in Switzerland. He rents out single rooms. House by a German couple for their daughter and her Digo husband, and so forth, right? So a lot of houses in the area that are sort of material, visible signs of these relationships, and also how these relationships have resulted in a certain economic stability for people in the area. Increased status within the local community. So if somebody's in a relationship with a European, that is often looked at something respectable. There is affection. That, I mean, these are not just transactional monetary relationships. And this is where me having sort of observed people for a longer period of time really helps me to have a better sense for that. Okay, so again, so once I published a book on this, and then I thought, so what do I do with this? What does this actually mean? And that was my big question. What does that mean in economic terms? Right? Because I thought, okay, I'm observing here aspects of the informal economy, but what do economists say? And so some of you already know this story, so I went to our economics department and to W.P. Carey, only to find out that nobody here in those units actually does work in this area, right? I mean, and the reasons I was given was that data is hard to get to, and somebody said, and I won't quote who it was, somebody said that the volume is not significant. And as we've heard from Clint in the introduction, if we look at Africa in particular, the volume is very significant. But then even within what is conventionally understood as the informal sector, what I observed is not addressed. Right? But now I've actually learned from some of my colleagues in your school, but also in other units that, well, actually no. I just wanted to mention is that, so we've formed now a little bit of a working group to try to find out where at Arizona State University is the work done on the informal sector, right? Because it is done. There are people in various schools, in Future of Innovation Society, in CHESC, in School of Politics and Global Studies, and so forth. So we have people here at School of Social Transformation. So we have people at ASU who do the kind of work that sheds light on this, but it hasn't had an impact on how economists look at the economy. So this is one of my key questions. So I wanted to take a look, quickly take a look with you at the official figures that are available for the informal sector. So Kenya National Bureau of Statistics says there are 25 million Kenyans of working age, 16 million are employed, and out of those, 13 are in the informal sector and 2.7 in the formal sector. And with all of that, they estimate the unemployment to be at 7.4%. And these are the various owners in which what they consider informal sector labor to be. Now, when we go
Nina,
to
worth noting is that's a very different definition than the informal sector in the U.S.
Yes.
They're counting most private sector jobs as informal,
Right.
which in U.S. economists would say those are formal jobs.
yes,
They can't be because the numbers were 13 million in the formal sector and 2.7 in the informal.
No, it was the opposite.
well, the problem is here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was the opposite.
These are the salaried people, officially salaried people. These are the people who pay income tax, and that's why they're counted.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's a
And-
different
and
definition
people-
than the U.S.
Well,
uses.
but for various reasons, right? Because people who work in the informal sector in Kenya in these areas usually don't pay income tax. There is some licensing and fees going on, and that's why it's really much more of a hybrid model, right? So that's something that is not really conceptually captured here. But I mean, for example, if somebody sells kangas, cloth on the beach, they have to have a license, and maybe just $10, but they have this license. But then none of their sales, revenue, or anything is registered anywhere. So that's why it's informal, right? So that's why even though it's private business, it's still informal, and it wouldn't count in the U.S. Well, in the U.S. there
Now, in
wouldn't be a
Europe, so
licensing.
what the Africans did was take a European model of formal employment. Has benefits, has insurance, has things like that. But in the U.S., we don't have this model for formal.
Okay, let's get to that in the discussion. So, so you've seen the figures of 7.4% unemployment. When we go to the United Nations Development Programme's Human Development Report of 2016, and they say in Kenya the unemployment rate was 39.1%. And that's because they have a very different mechanism of counting, and they don't acknowledge everybody who works in the informal sector. Now, the International Labour Organization, I found 3 different figures that are connected to the International Labour Organization. This is the last one is the one that's closest to the official Kenyan one, but there are all kinds of reasons for these variations. What are the consequences of these discrepancies? Right? I mean, if you assume that a country has a high unemployment rate, obviously your development approach will be very different. Right? If you have, I mean, so this is why how we categorize what counts and how we look at the different forms of labor affects economic development policy substantially. Right? So, I mean, that's obviously from my perspective, so what I've documented is not accommodated here at all, but I think we do have a lot of material here that can point to various forms of neocolonial relations through a theorizing of labor and through a theorizing of the economy. So if we assume that populations are actually doing better than what is recorded, for example, by the World Bank, then what are the consequences of that? Or perhaps formality or informality doesn't tell us enough really about economic stability, let alone quality of life. So data collection often requires anthropological field work, right? So we need more economists trained to sort of shift the needle here. And there are alternative models of thinking about the economy, right? And probably all of you in the room here, I mean, for me, this is the recent knowledge that I've been exposed to, but the diverse economies framework probably matches most of what I think is useful and really helpful to understanding these various forms of economic activity. And there are various networks. These are Australian-based scholars, Gibson and Graham. We view economy as referring to all of the practices that allow us to survive and care for each other and the earth, right? So then from thinking of people in the Diani area and all these various activities that they're doing, most of them in the informal sector, but some of them not even counted as informal sector work, right? And also this I think is a very interesting quote, right? I mean, to say that we live in a capitalist economy basically also ignores all these other forms of activities that are outside of the official, capitalist structures. So this is, you've probably also seen that as a graph, right? So this is what our folks over in economics and WP Carey look at, and this is what we look at. And I don't know, is anybody here from the economics department? So this is what we look at, right? All the other forms, and maybe in relationship to also what's on the surface here. But that, if we look at labor in Africa, and Clint talked about 85%, so that little graph here actually captures that, right? So there is a certain amount of labor that is officially recognized. That's the official GDP, GNP, but all of this exists, and it is what keeps communities alive and strong, and much stronger than what is conventionally assumed. And I think that is absolutely relevant for economic policy, right? So ignoring all of this makes it easier to argue that, Western countries need to move in and pursue certain development projects, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe that is subject for discussion. So I'll end here. Thank you so much.
So now we can open the floor for questions or discussion. Yes.
First of all, Nina, thank you for doing this. We've been trying here at SFIS to get you involved in our activities for a long time, as you know. And so, Clinton, did you do this? Congratulations. Being involved in the informal economy activity that we have, I've been kind of thinking about the theoretical structure or space that we would be occupying. And as it happens, our students in innovation and global development are looking at alternative models and critiques of those models. And one of the things that came to mind as you were speaking is Arturo Escobar's point that, and he was doing a critique of Amartya Sen, in which he said, Sen's, got nicer economics. But the mere fact that economics is at the center of the discourse makes it inherently colonizing. And first, I'd be interested to know what your reaction would be to that. Are we falling into the same trap by talking about the informal economy here?
Well, that's why I think my last slide about diverse economies, right, is sort of challenging that division, right? So is it really useful? I mean, I think we keep talking about the informal sector because that is the term that folks in economics and in the development world recognize.
Yeah.
Talking about diverse or mixed economies evidently doesn't seem to get much traction. So the question is, how can we get beyond that? Right? So I would like to shift the paradigm to no longer talk about the informal sector. But the question is, how do we do that? And maybe we should start here at ASU and invite our colleagues from economics and the business school to this kind of a conversation. Right? Because I think we need to start somewhere, and we have opportunities locally.
We have to serve something other than pizza to get them.
Sorry.
Yes.
This is super interesting, thank you. I'm trying to think about this in relationship to a couple of things that I think are not unrelated to Gary's question. So one of which is we're trying to understand the emerging design, and I use that word deliberately, opportunities for thinking about how various energy technologies get incorporated into social life. And we've been talking about market design as a very explicit piece of that, because even in Arizona there are 7 separate markets that take the relationship between the technology, the exchanges of money, and the forms of social organization and practice around those very differently across those, for solar energy, right? So 7 separate solar market designs. And then when we think about a lot of our projects in low-income communities, it becomes very significant how you build those designs. And in relationship to that, I'm still trying to figure out, how productively do we talk about the distinction between the pieces of that we decide to call the market, and where do we draw those lines, and the pieces of that we decide to refer to using other language like social practices, social arrangements, etc. In other words, trying not to go down the route of saying it's all economics or it's all social practices, but is there meaningful differentiation to be made, and at what line and why you would choose that division. And so that's one question that I was grappling with. And the other is trying to think about whether it's productive to differentiate between thinking about economic theory, thinking about economic metrics, and thinking about sort of what you might call economic models that sit in between the two. And so the question of whether the problem that you're identifying exists in all three of those, whether it exists in the ways that economic theories are encapsulated into particular models, which are then encapsulated in particular forms of metrics. And it's that translation process that's the problem, whether it's simply the metrics, right? And the decision to divvy up the data this way as opposed to this other way, and that has all kinds, and we know that measurement systems matter enormously to how you put theory to work, and the theory itself may not be as problematic as the choices you make about the measurement systems. And so trying to think a little bit about where should we be focusing our attention within the economic analytics in terms of understanding where the problem sort of lies. And it may, in fact, be squished out throughout all three. And we may have to deal with that. But I think it's worth digging in a little bit further to ask what problems exist in those three separate spaces, and the ways in which they're tied together or not, and what the implications are. Because it makes a big difference whether you just have to fix the measurement scheme or whether you have to correct the deep theoretical structures at the same time.
Yeah, thank you for these great questions and comments. I mean, to start with the second question, I think that it is in all three areas, right? I mean, the question could be raised whether we're just looking at economic activity that is monetized. Are we also including activities that are not monetized? Within the monetized realm, are we capturing everything? And this is what my argument was, we're not. Right? So in terms of relationship between North and South, Germany and Kenya, all kinds of economic transactions occur that are not captured in the GDP or GNP.
Right, but say, for example, environmental economics has gone an enormous way towards creating a set of theories of value that are not monetary specific and incredibly generic and applicable in lots of different ways. And yet most of the ways that that's put to work wouldn't capture much of what you're trying to capture here, because the particular measurement systems that they use for capturing their version of value, right? So their theory of value might well accommodate all of this, but their measurement systems don't.
Yeah, actually I just heard a talk by Jane Carter Williams. Did anybody hear that? On sort of trying to monetize capital that environmental habitats have, right? And to explain to insurance companies the value of protecting habitats for them down the road. So doing, let's say, protective measures would then have a benefit to those companies down the road in case there is flooding or XYZ, right? So yes, there is a lot happening there. It's a very specific area, and I was very excited to see that, that kind of work being done. But there are other areas where it's not being done, right? So I guess that is it. But then in terms of economic theory, really coming out of economics, right? That's where I would like to see the impact and the conversation. Because I think, especially also if you're thinking about development policy and how it is being developed, we still have the economists sitting at the table and having a lot of weight there, right? So even though some policy is of course affected by an awareness for this kind of work, but, or you tell me, maybe you have a different experience in this regard. In terms of the markets, if I think again about the Kenyan example, I see that there are a lot of entrepreneurial energies of people who are outside of the formal channels, the formal sector, who would be amazing partners for implementing, for example, solar energy or other energy-saving measures, and could really drive innovation in those countries. So I think, and then how do we set up these conversations, right? How do you set up these programs that would be not going, well, I mean, they could involve all kinds of different stakeholders, but how do you capture really the people who have the innovative and entrepreneurial potential?
And then this.
There was a question here.
Yeah, there's two.
Okay. All right.
So my question was, so it seems like one of your case, well, thank you for a wonderful talk first, and I'm really fascinated by the case study of the way that relationships permeate this economic transfer, but it seems like at the core of the failure of economics is this way in which affect is always banished from capitalism, right? So emotion, relationship, right? Feminist economics tries to address this through the role of mothering and care and these kinds of spaces. But if you look at what's not visible, it's often things that are associated with relationship, right? And what we're trained in capitalism, except for in kind of marketing, is to banish relationship from money, right? So there's these money that has ties to feeling, you know, or somehow wrong, right? But all of our economic activity is mired in bodies that have feelings. So I just wonder, I don't know economics very much beyond some, you know, slight work in feminist economics, but I wonder what, from your own research, how affect and how an ability to either quantify affect or to understand economics as something that's embedded in bodies and relationships might correct some of the blind spots, right?
Right. Well, I mean, I think this is where some of these slides that looked at, where was it here?
Yeah.
Right. So some of that labor, and that is rooted in an effective relationship. How do you monetize it, or how do you acknowledge the material reality that it creates? I think that's exactly the question, and I think it needs to be, you know, incorporated in this kind of analysis. So I think that for the Europeans, for example, who moved to Kenya, and I mean there are ways to probably attach monetary value to all of that, right? I mean, just like domestic labor is also monetized and so forth. So I think that would be good to draw on these kind of models. But it's absolutely essential, obviously. The affective dimension is what creates these relationships.
Or joy creates a good worker who can then do things, or love creates the inspiration to get money, right? So it's like the inability to quantify, like, we don't have to just quantify cooking. We could think about, you know,
Yes.
I mean, I don't know, I'm not an economist, I'm an anthropologist, I'm like, why not include love? But I just wonder if, if there's metrics for that, especially in the case of these people who fall in love with, both a place and a people and then work to transform it, that has visible impacts. And I don't know enough about feminist economics, but I could imagine someone who would want to do that, right? Yeah. Quality of life, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's why also when we talk at ASU about global futures and, how do we, come up with, often the idea is that we have to just come up with technological solutions to some of the problems we have in the world, right? So, okay, we invented negative carbon emission, which is an amazing technology, but maybe we need to ask some other questions about what kind of life we really are would like to build for the future. And that's where all the social justice issues come in and questions of equality and so forth.
Going into
Turn now.
So
Thanks a lot, Fahim, and
next time I'm not going to say this. For the presentation, I actually have two questions. But first, one comment for Gary. I don't agree with you on sense thing that you were talking about. Definitely, we should talk about it after this.
I'll talk about that tomorrow, but
I have at macro level two questions. One is you mentioned about the Kenyan affluent society to be moved into the same neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of relationship these people have with the local population?
Mm-hmm.
Is it kind of similar to the things that we're seeing between the Europeans and the Kenyans, local Kenyans, or there is some sort of a tension, or it's just as it is? We are looking into the cultural, economic difference between different economic classes within a country. What's your perception about that? Is it significantly different? Number two is, how are the NGO sector in Kenya doing?
The what?
And the NGO sector, the development sector there. Because working heavily with the Southeast Asian development scenarios, I kind of see there's a vacuum there, or is it? Or is it something that it's also there side by side with this expat communities inclusion in the economy, and how these things are recognized by the government itself? Because any kind of foreign currency we're getting in or out, no matter in which channels, and there are monitoring of those things. This guy going with his SUV from country like villages to villages, definitely the government is looking into it. And then are they okay with that? Is it some sort of a parallel thing, or are there intentions?
Great question, thank you. The first one, with folks from upcountry moving in, we have class as well as ethnic as well as religious issues. So a lot of upper class people from Kenya they tend to be from the Nairobi area. They tend to be groups that are Christian, also different ethnic groups, and they're mostly Christian. So they come into this area on the south coast that is traditionally Muslim and less educated and different ethnic groups. So you have everything clashing. And in fact, the local people have a higher resentment of the folks from Nairobi coming to the area than of the Europeans, who they feel are often more supportive of them and more respectful of them. It's really interesting. So there are these inner Kenyan tensions. In terms of the INGOs, in the area that I studied, Kwale district, as a larger district, at least the last time I asked, the only INGOs working there were UNICEF, or UNICEF is not an INGO, but UNICEF was represented, and Danida, the Danish development company. Everything else was either Kenyan in terms of organizations, or then all these contraband humanitarians. Well, actually, there was one other one, the Verkaart. Verkaart is a Dutch development INGO, Dutch INGO, founded by a Dutch industrialist who built more elementary schools and orphanages and secondary schools than the Kenyan government in the area over the last 20 years. I think 90 elementary schools, several secondary schools, and then orphanages and so forth. So he is always part of all these meetings that the government officials have. And you have sort of, I mean, sometimes there are coalitions, sometimes there are alliances, sometimes it's solidaric, but some of what goes on the ground is really intention, right? So for example, the contramundum humanitarian that I shadowed for a while, he is supporting, or they have built a school in an area where there were no permit even. I mean, the teachers weren't licensed, the school had no permit. And so I asked the government officials, I said, well, what do you do with that? Like, how do you feel about this? And they said, well, it's very frustrating because we may need a school over here, but those folks built it over there, and that's a problem. But at the end of the day, we'll take it because it's better to have that school than not have it. So they have a very ambivalent relationship to that.
Because sometimes it kind of borderlines with this celebrity aid and stuff. Because you mean well, but then if you're not part of the bigger plan, and then
Yes.
it's kind of, it doesn't go.
Yeah, and of course it's unthinkable. I mean, if China, for example, decides to address poverty in the United States, right, and then sends people into our impoverished areas and decides to build schools, obviously that wouldn't happen like that, right? So, but that's what a lot of
They
these
build factories.
humanitarians are doing. Yeah, but it's really interesting to think about it this way, right? I mean, the license that these ordinary folks from Europe take, I mean, and have, to pursue all kinds of things that interfere with the responsibility of the state. Yeah, I mean, it's stunning. Yeah.
So I just want to say we're actually out of time. It's right at 1 p.m. But so I just want to let everyone know that that if you need to go, it's fine. But I do believe this young lady in the back right here has been waiting to ask a question.
Okay, and I can ask it later.
Yes, and it's somebody who's worked in Kenya since the early 90s.
So I'll ask about Kenyan colleagues, and pursuant to the very first question, which was looking at, colonizing patterns, not only of the types of on-the-ground activities of Europeans and so on, but what are some Kenyan or Tanzanian scholars doing in this area that you might be aware of? Is this something that has been taking up much? I know informal
Yes.
sector
Yes.
and micro enterprise and those kinds of things are studied, but I just wondered if you had colleagues doing similar.
So there's one Kenyan scholar called Maurice Amotabi who has written a very an interesting book on the NGOization of Kenya, right? So where that is exactly addressed, that NGOs are present in many areas, and my area may not have that many examples, and most of it may be upcountry and around Nairobi. And he also coined the term philanthropy, which I think is a very good term to use. So philanthropy, NGOization, right? I mean, the Kenyan state forbids, for example, that medications are brought into the country for free, but it happens at a very large scale, and it kills the local pharmaceutical market, and it interferes with the ministry and all kinds of things, right? I mean, I went to one Ministry of Health representative. They had a whole storage room for all these goods that were donated that were completely useless. So that's a big problem. And so there's some work on that, but there's also, Kenya doesn't have a very strong critique of capitalism in general, so I think that's part of the challenge.
I think so when you showed how many people are in the informal sector,
Yes.
how many are in the informal sector and paying taxes, I couldn't help but thinking about a starving government that doesn't have enough money to provide services. to
That's
their
not
population.
what's happening. It's the
Um,
highest paid parliament in the world.
So-
And the parliamentarians' wives are paid
But I mean,
They have
for
plenty of money.
public services, so that was my question. Are there enough public services provided by government? Is there enough infrastructure? Is there enough, and for what I'm hearing, a school is placed here because there's not a plan, the government didn't have much say on it because they didn't sponsor that school. So what I'm wondering is, you were mentioning another concept that was really, really interesting, is maybe a new way to do things, right? What's the new way? Maybe it's not just the typical capitalist model. Is there maybe a possibility that the government will work with this people that are in the informal sector, so together can build and can build something that will work for everyone, right? And it will have order. Is there any concept like that?
So that's why the Kenyan government does work with the people in this sector. And that's what I mentioned earlier. That's why these formal, informal doesn't really describe what's going on, because these 30 million people, a lot of them pay fees and all kinds of other taxes to the government, right? They're not income tax. They don't pay income tax, but they pay other fees and taxes. And so the revenue is not just limited to income tax. And then also the government, of course, gets aid packages, right? So there's money coming into the country through other sources too. But I think that's exactly it. These figures don't capture what is going on. And if you travel to Kenya, you see that there's so much building. I mean, there's so much emotion, so much building. There's so many new cars. There's so much wealth in the country, right? And it doesn't match up at all with the image that a lot, let's say, the news in the United States projects about African countries. Obviously, there are different African countries, and Kenya is one of the more entrepreneurial ones. But similar things happen in Ghana and many other countries. Right? So
but they also have like a high debt with China. Like, so there's a lot of like foreign investment through the Chinese, but it's I think one of the largest percentages of debt from China. So like, investment is going, but what does that mean for the future?
Yes, no, I mean, that is a whole other chapter, right?
Yeah.
The new debt politics and China moving into this, absolutely. Yeah.
I do have a question. I'm fairly new to the entire world of development. So you mentioned that the locals have a better view of the Europeans as opposed to the affluent African, the Kenyans moving in. What is the overall? How do they see the Europeans as far, leaving aside economy for a second, how do they see the Europeans? I mean, what is the role between the Europeans and the locals? Like the colonial aspect of it, how is it removed completely during that, relationship?
I don't think it's completely removed, right?
It's
and it
still
also
there.
depends a little bit. So for example, that was that's why this research on the marriage licenses was interesting to me, because the British who are in the country, the same number of British are vacationing in Kenya as Germans. I mean, especially in the 90s, right? Same number of people, but completely different interaction, right? And that is largely due to the colonial history. So look, Kenyans, and that is true for all different educational levels or ethnic group and so forth. I mean, they stay away a little bit from the British, right? Although in the last 10 years that has shifted a little bit. So I think with another generation, it slowly changes. Eastern Europeans are also growing in presence in Kenya, and they don't have these kind of histories in Africa. I think that mostly the relationship is really more defined through financial or money, simply, right? Rather than colonial history. And that is seen as opportunity. I think also that within Kenya, I mean, there is obviously an awareness for the colonial history, but people also have so much resentment of their post-colonial governments, right? So there is so much resentment of the current government and the corruption that it sort of, relativizes colonial violence in retrospect. I mean, does that make sense? I'm taped here. It's kind of a difficult thing to say, but it doesn't. Obviously, it doesn't erase it, and it depends still on whether in which group you are talking to, whether you're talking to an educated person or not. But I think the resentment to the current government is so strong that it overpowers other histories. Let's put it this way.
Can I just make a comment? So going off of that, I was like a little skeptical about the whole interracial relationships as like an economic transaction, kind of, and I don't think it should be simplified to just that, but I also think you still need to bring in the colonial aspect, even if like their country wasn't part of colonialism there, I still think that there is a linkage there that you can't dismiss, and so I think that should be an important part of, you know, analyzing these relationships, but also acknowledging that, you know, we have moved on from the colonial era to some extent. So, well, maybe not overlooking some colonial aspects, but not only seeing these relationships as economic transactions either.
No, and there are also, like, if you start talking about the economic side, there is often a very strong benefit for both sides, right? I mean, so if we're looking deeper into the emotional connection, I mean, it really depends on every individual couple. People, I've seen so much variation that I have a hard time saying that, okay, the Europeans are, let's say, in a stronger role in terms of how they're controlling the relationship, or then the stronger power role. I don't think that's the case. And I do think that very often Americans come to Africa with American ideas about race, and it really doesn't work like that. And it's really a different story. It's, I don't know, maybe other people can speak to that too. If you are in a majority black country, you know, it is different from when you are in a country like the settler colony of the United States, where the majority of people, at some point at least, were white. And it's just a very different relationship between different groups.
I'm going to make a quick comment. Just one is that there's historical examples. So Senghor, his wife was French, the independent leader of Senegal. Nkrumah had a very, very well-known affair with his British secretary.
Kofi Annan's
Jomo
wife was
Kofi Annan.
Kenyatta's first wife was, or second wife was British.
Kofi Annan, in a much different era, married a woman from Sweden. No one ever asked him to apologize for that. And it certainly wasn't done to help the Swedish woman economically. So I think one of the issues is that there's a deep history. Anthony Appiah, a very prominent philosophy professor at Princeton now, his father married a British woman. Joe Appiah was a very prominent Ghanaian, married a British woman in the 50s, late 50s. So you have a long history of this. And then I think in the German sense, because they had a colony that they lost in World War I, Tanganyika, that was very, very close to this area. So for Germans, there's a yearning to reconnect with Africa. And the southern, where Nina's studying, is very close to the Tanzania border. The Italians, for instance, in the north, I don't think they're as open to intermarriage. There's a very interesting book by a German woman called The White Maasai about her marriage to a male Maasai. Very, very interesting, quite vivid. So, you know, that's one set of historical context that this occurs in, and is worth noting. But I think Nina's unsentimental and non-judgmental approach to it is very refreshing, because many people in development space are moralizing about this and even passing rules on it. MSF has had a series of scandals about their staff being sexually involved, let's set aside romantically, with local people. And this is apparently something they can't tolerate anymore. Used to be fine, now it's not fine anymore. MSF is very, very influential because it's such a powerful and pervasive group. So, yeah.
Great. Andrew?
So is anybody, I think, are there any more questions, or?
Yeah.
Just one more?
Sure.
How the corruption affects becoming in Kenya? And for example, the government or
Okay, I didn't hear the first part. What is the
corruption?
The corruption? Oh, yeah. That's a big part of the story. I mean, that's part of the resentment that the population has of its leadership. And also some of this contraband humanitarian work, in a way, feeds corruption, right? So resources come in from outside of the country, and they're given to the local health sector or education and so forth, and they don't necessarily maybe register the donations they've received or whatever it is, right? So it can really feed corruption too. Big part of the story, for sure. Okay. Thank you so much for all the questions and comments.
Thank you for coming.
Yes,
We really
thank
appreciate it.
you. All right.